In today's episode of Gear Diet, the Nikon Z6, or Z6, depending on where you live. Hi, and welcome to the Gear Diet series, where I talk about pieces of equipment that I'm renting this year to try out, see where they fit into the lineup, and get a chance to really enjoy all the photography has to offer while not breaking the budget. My name is Christopher Malcolm. I'm a Los Angeles-based lifestyle, fitness, and activewear photographer. I shoot advertising campaigns for some of the largest kind of fitness brands in the world, as well as do some editorial work. And I generally don't like to talk about gear all the time, but I know since we're all photographers and, gear and talking about our new toys it's fun. But I've noticed something in the last couple years, which is that I've been overspending on gear. I've been enjoying it a little too much. So in order to fix that problem, this year I'm going on a gear diet. Now, I talked about what the gear diet is in my previous video, but basically the long and short of it is, instead of buying anything new this year, I'm going to each month rent a new toy, see how I enjoy it and kind of get as much enjoyment out of it as possible, save some money in the process. And I thought it might be fun to take you guys along for the journey. So I'm preparing these videos each time I rent something new, what I liked, what I didn't like. These won't be traditional video reviews of gear where you talk about, all the specs and all the stuff. Because that type of stuff, I always feel like you can kind of read on a website if you want to. I'll be talking more about why I chose to rent a particular piece of gear, how I see that gear fitting into my own workflow, and just kind of general impressions after working with it. How does it work in the real world? Could I actually use it? And could it potentially be so good that it would kick something out of my current camera bag? So for month one of the gear diet, I decided to spend my rental allowance on the Nikon Z6. Now, I should mention that throughout this video, you will actually be seeing the Z6. That's because I have already sent it back. I intended to actually shoot a video earlier last week when I still had the camera, but I was sick. So I thought rather than shoot a video with my nose running, I would just wait and you also have to imagine what the Z6 looks like in my hand, but you get the picture. So now, why did I choose the Nikon Z6? So I am a lifetime Nikon shooter. I mean, that's where I started my career with the D200 years ago, and it just kind of progressed with Nikon ever since. I love their cameras. They make sense to me, probably because that's how I started my career. That's what I've always used. So I've got the muscle memory to just kind of be able to use one without thinking about it a lot, which is great when you're trying to be creative, because you want your equipment basically to just kind of get out of the way, and Nikon can do that for me. But of course, over the years, after you use a tool so much and it gets to be that point where it's just automatic, sometimes it just becomes a little too routine, which is why a couple years ago I started using some of the Fuji cameras, both because they were lightweight, but also because they were just a little fun, a little different. For my motion work, I use the Canon C200, which is kind of the perfect balance of being able to kind of just grab and go. It's small enough that it can be operated by one person. But what's great about it is that it still has enough ports and connection points that it can be built up. So when I am shooting with a larger crew and, I need to have a focus puller, assistance, I need to have everything kind of in place, I can still do that as well. So it's kind of the best of both worlds to me. It's kind of it's that little sweet spot right in the middle. So with all that on tap, why did I choose to go and rent the Z6? What could that possibly have to offer? Well, as you might have picked up from my earlier discussion of what's currently in my camera bag, I've got Nikon, Canon, Fuji medium format, and Fuji APS-C. So basically I've got 6 different cameras, 3 different camera brands, 4 different mounts. And so every time I go out and shoot, if I wanted to use each of those cameras for different things, I'd have to bring not only each of those cameras, but also each of their own sets of lenses, each of their own sets of accessories, and it gets to be a lot. So with the Nikon Z6, my biggest curiosity would be to see if it could replace some of those other items in my camera bag, and if I could then kind of condense everything into a smaller package. Right now, I generally go out with 2 camera bags. I have a still camera bag, which has, my Nikon, my D850, my D750, all my Nikon lenses, or an assortment of Nikon lenses, plus, small Profoto lights. And then I have my video bag, which has my Canon C200, all the audio equipment and everything like that to be able to do motion work. Then I have a third case, which has all my Fuji gear in it, and everything related to that, which that sometimes that goes with me, sometimes that doesn't go with me. But at least the Nikon bag and the Canon bag tend to go on every shoot. So it'd be great to be able to condense all that into one bag. I've actually tried to do that with the Nikon and the Canon camera, and I can do it, but it becomes very large. So it'd be nice to do it with a smaller, lighter bag, shall we say. So really for me, the biggest promise of mirrorless cameras is, for a hybrid shooter, so someone who's shooting stills and video, is being able to switch back and forth within the same body and have it be a much lighter camera to carry around. Personally, because I get confused easily, I like having two different bodies because I like to have a camera that's dedicated to stills and it's always kind of set up perfectly for that, and another camera that's dedicated to video. So even if the cameras can do both, just mentally it's easier for me. If I have one camera here doing stills and I need to go video, I just pick up the other camera and go, there is as few things that I have to think about in the middle of a shoot, the better. So for me, two bodies is always great. But, not everybody can afford to have two bodies. Sometimes you got to have things all in one, or sometimes you're doing a shoot where it's not practical to carry a lot of different equipment. So you need to just be able to have one camera do the be all end all. And in those situations, I think mirrorless cameras really take the cake. Now, had Nikon released a Z6 or Z7 earlier, there's a good chance that I wouldn't necessarily have the Canon C200 because, it would have been great to be able to stay in the Nikon family, but because of when they released it when they did, it was a little late and I'd already gotten into a different system for video and I'd actually gotten into another system for mirrorless. So what I'm kind of trying to see now is whether or not it makes sense to eventually kind of come all the way back home. So why did I run the Z6 instead of the Z7? Well, it's pretty simple. I shoot with the D850, which is 47 megapixels, and the GFX 100, which is 102 megapixels. So I like to shoot with high megapixel cameras. So I think if I were to actually buy the Z6 or Z7, I'd probably buy the Z7 just because it would, make sense within my own workflow and what I need. But for the purposes of the gear diet, I decided to rent the Z6 because it's obviously less expensive. Therefore, I can run it longer, put it through more paces, and kind of really get a better handle on it. Since the only real difference between the Z6 and Z7 is really just the sensor size. The ergonomics and the way the cameras work are pretty much exactly the same. Also, 24 megapixels is plenty. Unless you're making large prints, like say, I do a lot of advertising work, which is why I like high megapixel cameras, because I like to make, or my clients like to make really large prints. They like to crop, they like to do all this different type of stuff. But I knew that I wouldn't be shooting anything specifically with this Z6 that would need that. So for me, 24 megapixels is pretty much enough to do pretty much anything else you want to do when it comes to making personal prints. I had also read, and this is kind of important point, that the video on the Z6 is actually better than the Z7. Now, I'm not a technical person, so I can't break down the math in terms of exactly why that is. But basically, it comes down to the lower megapixel count on the Z6 and the higher megapixel count on the Z7. So for stills, the higher megapixel count is great. But when it comes to 4K, the amount of downsampling that needs to happen with the Z7 leads to a slightly less impressive image than the Z6, which doesn't have to downsample quite as much. There are people who can explain that a lot better than I can, but that's the gist of it. But essentially, the Z6 is actually better for a video dedicated camera. So what was I looking for with the Z6? So, okay, there's a couple things that I was looking for with the Z6. So primarily, with it being a mirrorless camera, I wanted to see if it was lighter. I wanted to obviously check out the image quality, see how it performed compared to my D850, or probably more accurately the D750, since they're both around the same megapixel count. I wanted to kind of feel the ergonomics, which is big for me in terms of how does it feel in my hand? Does it feel right? Is it something that I enjoy shooting with? And the main thing I wanted to check out, which is very subjective to me, but I think is kind of very important in terms of being able to judge the value of an investment, is I have the Z6, but of course I already have my existing equipment. So over the course of the month, I wanted to see how often was I reaching for the Z6 versus the other cameras? Why was I reaching for the Z6 versus the other cameras? And why was I not reaching for the Z6 versus the other cameras? So a lot of this will be very subjective, but I just want to kind of give you, again, my firsthand experience to let you know kind of what I thought about the camera. Again, not in terms of specs, because the specs you need will be dependent on the type of stuff you shoot. But just in terms of a personal experience, thinking ahead, you know, if I were to invest in a camera like this, where would it fit within my camera bag? So the first thing I would notice is that while it was light, it wasn't that much lighter than my D750, which I was kind of surprised by. You know, the first mirrorless camera I ever picked up, I still remember I was standing over there actually, and I had rented the Sony A7 R3, and I remember the first time I took it out of the box, and I was shocked at how light that thing was. It made no sense to me how a camera could be that light, and so it was a real shift. And so with the Z6, I was expecting to get that same kind of feeling going from the D850 or D750 to picking up the Z6. I expected to be kind of blown away by that. Now, there's no doubt the Z6 is definitely lighter than either of the DSLRs, but I will say it wasn't that much lighter. I think that might be just because since that first time I was with a mirrorless camera, I've owned the Fuji X-T3, spent a lot of time shooting with that, and a lot of other mirrorless systems, and so maybe I'm just over the whole, you know, mirrorless is lighter thing, but it wasn't as much lighter as I expected it to be. Another thing that I realized is that my hand was actually getting more tired shooting with the Z6 than with the D750, and it took me a while to figure it out, but I finally figured out what it was, which is the Z6 obviously is smaller, which means it's actually shorter. And so I realized what was happening is that when I picked up the camera to shoot, because of the size of my hands, so this would, you know, if you have smaller hands, this would make no difference. But because of the size of my hands, I was only able to put my middle finger and my ring finger on the grip of the Z6. The pinky finger would kind of dangle off the bottom. Versus this D750, I was able to get all three of these fingers around the grip. So whereas the Z6 was lighter, I was only able to hold it with two fingers, versus the other one was marginally heavier, but I was holding it with three fingers. Because of that, I think it didn't feel as light as I wanted it to feel. Now, I know you can probably buy I think there's an extra battery part thing that you could put onto the Z6, which will probably make it a little bit, you know, taller. But then again, it'll also make it heavier, thereby negating the whole idea of mirrorless being a lighter camera. So that was interesting. I mean, it's not like a red flag or anything that would stop me from buying the camera necessarily, but I didn't expect that, and I was kind of interested in that. As for the electronic viewfinder, which is very important to me, you know, electronic viewfinders are kind of the big selling point of mirrorless cameras, because, you know, you can kind of see what it is you're shooting before you shoot it. But for me, like, and again, this is just me, they're almost kind of the weak point of mirrorless cameras, because I don't like looking at screens any more than I have to, and I really actually prefer optical viewfinders where I can just look through the glass. Now, with that said, electronic viewfinders have come a long way. They're cleaner, they're sharper, and so I'm not bashing mirrorless. I'm just saying, for my own personal weirdness, I like optical viewfinders. I like looking through glass rather than a screen. I should also admit that I think I handicapped the Z6 a little bit in the sense that the lens that I rented with it was the kit lens, the 24-70 f4. Now, the reason I went with that lens as opposed to one of the other ones or the adapter was because I wanted to give the Z6 the full advantage of weight, which again turned out to not to be as big of a benefit as I was expecting. But I really wanted to make that as light of a package as possible that I'd have to be trying to carry around. And so I went for the f4 instead of the 2.8, figuring that might be lighter. And then I also liked how short the kit lens compacts. So if you're throwing it into your bag, it's very easy to kind of toss in and out. Now, there's a flip side to that. While it was great to be able to get that lens nice and compact, what I didn't realize until I started shooting with it is that 24-70 f4 has this annoying locking mechanism. So you have to unlock it and expand it before you can shoot anything. So if you're, like, say, on the street doing some street shooting, or you're in a fast moving situation, I was constantly forgetting. I want to just grab the camera and pick it up and shoot. And I was constantly forgetting I had to pick it up, uncock it, then unroll it, then it was an added step that was unnecessary. I realized they do it because I guess that makes it smaller when it fits into the bag. But that extra step did get to be a little bit annoying. The lens was plenty sharp, so it was fine. It was just the mechanics of having to go through that each time I was shooting were like an unnecessary bummer. I think if I were to actually own the Z6, I would probably just have the adapter and use my existing Nikon glass and be good with it. So one of the main reasons why I didn't jump on the Z6 or Z7 when it was first released is because of all the kind of feedback I'd heard about the autofocus and that there might be kind of autofocus issues. Well, I am pleased to say during my rental period, I didn't really have any trouble with that. I know they did an update to the firmware during since the systems were released, and I think they fixed a lot of those things. I found that the face and the eye autofocus worked very, very well, especially when the subjects were close up. Now, personally, I like to do a lot of shots where the subject is kind of a little bit in the distance or part of more of a complicated setting, so it's not just their face. So I noticed in situations like that, the camera did struggle a bit to necessarily find the face or find the eye and track with the subject when they were kind of smaller within the frame. When I got up closer, it had no problem at all identifying the eye, identifying face, and kind of doing what it needed to do. One of the things that you miss with the mirrorless cameras from Nikon is the awesome kind of 3D autofocus tracking that's in the DSLRs. The D850, I always, if I'm having a subject kind of moving across frame, it's very easy to just kind of be in 3D tracking mode, lock onto the subject, and it'll just track that person all over the frame, and it's beautiful. You have something similar with the Z6. It's like a multi-step process where you have to hit the OK button a couple times, and it finds the person, and then it locks on, and you run it, and the person runs around, and it will actually kind of go around with them. So it's effective. It's a little clunky in the implementation, but it works. I still think the 3D autofocus on the DSLR system from Nikon is better. So I'd love to see something like that in a potential Z8 or a Z9. But it was pretty accurate. My friend Jamie and I went out to the beach here in Los Angeles to do a shoot. I was going to do a fitness shoot. It was about to rain literally the whole time. That little area where it's just about, it hasn't started raining yet, but it's about to start, and you could tell. I wanted to do it fairly quickly, so we're out at the beach. I did not have permits for this one, meaning I had to work super inconspicuously, so I did not bring out light stands and strobes and reflectors and stuff like that. So I had to kind of work with natural light for the most part. The only exception to that being that just for fun, I just brought out another little toy out of my bag. Cost me $25. This is a Viltrox VL162T. It's a little LED handheld light, and it didn't cost a whole lot, but I was just curious to see what would happen and if I was able to kind of generate some of the results that I would normally get with my strobes, just holding that. The advantage of that, again, being that it's small, so if I'm shooting and the permit people come along or somebody, or it's crowded for some reason, I can just slide this into my pocket and move on with the rest of my life, which is actually really good. I got this great shot of Jamie sitting on this bench, and normally the way I would have created that shot is I would have taken the camera underexposed and then brought up her exposure with the strobe, put the stand over there. And instead, I was able to do it with that little $20 LED light off of Amazon. I realize that's not a review of the Z6, but very useful, $20 well spent. That's not part of the gear diet because I already had that, but I decided to bring that out. When I was working with her, what I was really trying to do is just try to see, again, put the camera through its paces. Because we were kind of short on time and limited on resources, it was a great way to kind of test out the camera and see how it would perform in difficult situations. And I'm happy to say it did quite well. I had her kind of running along the beach to see how the camera did in terms of keeping her in focus. And it did a good job. It did a nice job. It struggled a little bit when things got darker outside, which a lot of cameras will struggle with. But in general, it did a very acceptable job in terms of keeping her tracked. I mean, I still think that if you're shooting a lot of sports, if sports is like your primary area, which I'm not really a sports shooter, but I share a lot of the same needs as someone who shoots, like say on the sideline of a game. I think the DSLRs are still the way to go, which is one of the main reasons I think, people are, well, why is Nikon bringing out a new D5 or new D6 and all that stuff? Well, it's because DSLRs still really excel when it comes to capturing fast moving subjects and being able to get to a clear view and track them with your eye. DSLRs still are kind of the king in that area, if you ask me. But I think you probably could shoot some fast moving stuff here with the Z6. As I said, I didn't have too much trouble with it. I still preferred the experience of shooting that with my DSLR, but it wasn't a red flag for the Z6 necessarily. It was nimble. It was able to keep her in focus. Viewfinder was nice and clean, and I was able to capture multiple frames without really feeling the mirrorless blackout at all. It was able to provide a nice file with nice latitude that could be pulled and pushed a bit in post. I say in general it was plenty acceptable. I created a series I was very happy with, and something that I could definitely use, for a professional campaign. Also did some self-portraits with the camera. I was really wanted to see how sharp the image would be in a kind of a portrait setting. So I set up this scenario in my backyard to just test it out and try to basically recreate moonlight. I had a strobe over my head to this side, and I had a nice little bounce card over here, and it did a really great job. I mean, the color rendition of Nikon is fantastic, and that's really carried over from the DSLRs right into the mirrorless world. So that's a big advantage. If you're already a Nikon shooter and you're already used to the way the files look, you won't be disappointed. The image quality will be just as good. The images are sharp, and the color is fantastic as you've always come to expect from Nikon. So now where the Z6 really did stand out, and I kind of expected this, but it was really driven home during my rental period, was in video. So if you're primarily someone who shoots a lot of video, with maybe shoots some stills on the side, but it's primarily a video shooter, I think the Z6, I think you'll be happy as a clam with the Z6. I did a little bit of side-by-side testing with the X-T3 and the C200 and the Z6, and I found that I actually preferred the video from the Z6 a little bit over the X-T3, which surprised me because I use the X-T3 video quite a bit. Usually my video package, I lead with the C200, and that's pretty much what I shoot all my video with. The X-T3 generally comes out as a gimbal camera because it's light and easy to kind of move around, or it comes out because, well, this being Los Angeles, other cities probably don't have this problem, but we have what they call permit police, which is because Hollywood's here. If they see you with anything looking remotely like a professional camera, police will pull you over, ask for your permit. If you don't have one, you can get serious fines. It's a big pain in the arse. It's not easy to shoot outside in Los Angeles, especially if you're carrying around a big cinema camera like the C200 or even like the Z6. I noticed was a little bit big. It probably draws a little bit of attention versus like the X-T3 I usually bring out because it's easy to talk people into thinking it's a touristy camera as long as you don't have a big crew with you. It looks like a toy, but it creates great images. So that's usually why I've been using the X-T3 for video over the C200 in some circumstances. Is just because I can get access to areas I can't get into with the C200. Now, obviously, if you have permits, that's not a problem, but they don't always have permits. So there's that. So video specifically is the area where I think the Z6 can really compete. I still prefer the C200 a little bit, just some of it feels a wee bit more cinematic to me, but that's personal taste. That's just completely me. I also prefer the added, hookups and the jacks and all that type of stuff for the C200. But as I said, you don't always need that. So if we're talking about just image quality for image quality, and I'm shooting in a situation where I'm not going to have, a large video crew or video village that I got to relay images back to or footage back to, or where it's just like me shooting in like a one-man band situation, which I do quite a bit, I think the Z6 would be a great alternative for that. As I said, I think the image quality actually was a little better than the X-T3, at least felt a little more cinematic than the X-T3 to me. So I'd be more than happy to use the Z6 in that scenario. As actually, I think probably if you look at the cameras that are in my collection between the D850, the D750, C200, the XT3, and then the X100F, I think the camera that the Z6 most competed with was actually the XT3. Again, the XT3 has some advantages of being small and inconspicuous, but in terms of image quality, I like the Z6, and more importantly, selfishly, because I'm a Nikon shooter and because my bag is already filled with Nikon equipment, the advantage to me of having a Z6 versus the Fuji would have been that I can just share lenses between them. So instead of having to bring the Nikon set, the Nikon with all the lenses, and then the Fuji with several lenses for that, I can just bring the Nikon and then throw the Z6 body in their bag somewhere and just share lenses between them. So it would make my bag a lot smaller. So practically speaking, if you're a Nikon shooter, that's a big advantage. If you're not a Nikon shooter, it doesn't necessarily help you out as much. But if you are a Nikon shooter like me and your bag is already filled with Nikon stuff, that could actually be a big advantage for you. So after a month, what did I find? Well, specific to the cameras that are already in my gear closet, I did find that I was still, when I wanted to go out and shoot stills, whether it be for work or for walking around, I still was reaching for my DSLRs. I think I just like the optical viewfinder. I just like the experience of shooting stills with a DSLR more than a mirrorless camera at the moment. While the C6 gave me great stills, very comparable to the D750, I still found myself gravitating towards the other cameras for jobs where stills were dominant. For video was a bit of a different story. For video, I found myself reaching for the Z6 quite a bit. I think the full-time autofocus on the Z6, where you can just kind of set it up and it'll just find your face and it'll just do it. It just works great in video. So I really found myself reaching for that. I think I could see an alternative where I would use that instead of my C200 in a lot of situations. I said again, especially in situations where it's just me and I don't need a big crew, I think the Z6 would be great. And especially I think it would be great because I can fit the Z6 body into my camera bag, and I did kind of take out the need of having to carry a whole separate camera bag for video, which is I currently do. So who's the ideal candidate to actually purchase the Z6? I think the ideal candidate to purchase the Z6 is an existing Nikon user who has Nikon glass, is looking to get into video or is serious about video and wants to have a second body dedicated just for that setup. You don't have any camera at all, and you're looking for something that's going to be the body that can do a lot of video and some stills as well. If you're stills driven, I'm still partial to DSLRs, but if you're video driven, especially the Z6 is your move. Or I said, if you're a hybrid shooter and you need to be able to do both within the same body, the Z6 is also a really, really good choice. Price-wise, I think it's well positioned. I mean, I saw some used Z6s online for about $1,200. Brand new, I think it was around $1,700 last time I looked, or that might have just been a Christmas special. But you know, those are $1,200 to $1,700 for this camera. Is a good price for a full-framed video camera, you know, beast like this. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to play with the new RAW recording. That's one big advantage that my C200 has, which is, you know, it's very easy to kind of grab and go. And sometimes when you're grabbing and going, you mess up your exposure by a stop or two, or your white balance isn't exactly perfect. And so what the C200 does with the RAW feature is you're able to kind of, just like a still, you know, after the fact, you can make little minor tweaks to the RAW file, to the RAW video file, and kind of compensate if you've made a mistake. Now, obviously the idea is to not make a mistake, but you know, nobody's perfect. So every now and then you're gonna mess up. And it's nice to have that security to know that you can kind of push and pull things a little bit without things getting too crazy out of whack. The recent release of the RAW firmware for the Z6 makes that, to me, as a steal. Like if you're a video maker, that could be a game changer right there. Now, of course, that's a separate add-on that you have to purchase. And since I was just renting the camera, I didn't purchase the RAW firmware update. So I can't tell you exactly how that works. But the promise of that is really impressive. And again, that would be a mark in the Z6's favor if I were ever in a position where I wanted to, say, for example, sell the C200 and just use the Z6 as my main video camera. Or again, if I was comparing the Z6 to an X-T3 or another similar kind of video device, I think that the RAW recorder definitely gives the Z6 a leg up. So I think the camera would be a good investment were I to actually own it, but I don't own it because the gear died and I rented it and I sent it back. And I got a great deal of enjoyment out of it. And now I'm ready to shoot with the next thing. Speaking of which, I could use your help with that. So month number 1 is over, but month number 2, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to rent, and for what I want to rent not only next month, but for these next months to come over the course of the year. So if you have some suggestions, if there's some equipment that you really want me to check out, do go ahead and leave that in the description. If you're taking the gear diet with me, let me know how you're doing. Use hashtag gear diet and I'll be able to see that. And just let me know kind of what you're doing. What are you trying out this month? What are you renting? What do you want to see from your gear? If you're a Z6 user and there's something that I have not covered here, because I said I was only renting the camera. So I know there's a lot more that someone who's had it for a year will be able to see and be able to tell me about it. Then I would know. So if you're in that camp, definitely leave your comments down there in the comment section and let me know what you think. If there's questions you have about it, I will definitely try to answer as many questions I had that I was able to discover about the Z6, or one of the other Z6 users I'm sure will chime in and offer you a suggestion. So anyway, hopefully that helped you out. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more of the products I'll be reviewing during my gear diet, or if you'd like to join along with the party, hashtag gear diet, let me know in the comment section, and definitely make sure to hit that subscribe button so you'll see more of these videos as I put them up. Until then, hope you guys are having a great week, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Happy shooting.